please welcome me in joining. Join me in welcoming. 2 days is too long. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
So thank you all for coming. Thanks for the opportunity to give this paper. Special thanks to the Moral Beacons Project, to the Templeton Religion Trust, and to Auburn University at Montgomery, my home institution, for the support of this exploratory project. I should emphasize this is an exploration, probably more than a defense today, but that's okay. It's early stages in these projects, and I'm grateful for your feedback as we go. In the next 30 minutes or so, I hope to sketch in broad outlines some of the highlights from my work on social forms of exemplarity, specifically exemplary communities. The central premise of this project was that current studies of exemplarity are too narrow in their focus. They're too narrow because although they teach us a great deal about virtue, about moral excellence, the central targets of these studies are individuals. The individual hero, the individual saint, the individual sage. In my work, I proposed to explore exemplarity writ large. So some of the funding went to finish up some essays that deal with social dimensions of particular virtues, specifically the virtues of hope, humility, and compassion. Those are already published, but I'm not going to talk about them today. Some of those were co-authored pieces as well. Today I want to talk about a little bit about the essays that really the bulk of the funding went to write. And there are 4 essays here, the first 3 of which deal with particular communities. So the first essay, Exemplary Communities and the Virtues of Acknowledged Dependence, focuses on the L'Arche communities. These are communities, a network of homes devoted to developing friendships between caregivers and core members who have significant or profound cognitive impairments, physical disabilities. The second one, Exemplary Communities and the Virtues, a case study, focuses on a village in France that engaged in an extraordinary effort to rescue Jewish children during the Holocaust. The third focuses on several communities, and it's really an argument about virtue formation. That is, I take that appeals to exemplars, individual exemplars, serves important aims in moral education, and I argue in that paper that appeals to exemplary communities or social exemplars can serve similar sorts of aims. The final is I don't focus on a particular community, but the goal in that project is to think about the ways in which communities who hope on others' behalf can support individual hope in difficult circumstances. So those are the essays that I've worked on as a result of this funding. What I've been working on primarily in the past few months is a book manuscript titled, this is a very clever title, you might not know what it's about after reading the title. It's a virtue-based defense of perinatal hospice. And this is it's an outgrowth of this work, but really it's a book in applied virtue ethics, where I seek to show how professional communities, nurses, doctors, chaplains, counselors, social workers, along with personal communities, can manifest important virtues for families who have received an adverse in utero diagnosis of a significantly life-limiting condition. So the central heart of this book is to look at particular ways in which these programs manifest particular virtues, specifically the virtues of hospitality, hope, solidarity, and compassion. So that's what I've been working on primarily, and I'm going to not talk about that at all for the rest of this talk. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. So today, what I want to do is just offer a few words about what I take social exemplars to be, offer a rationale, a general rationale for their study. Then section 4, I'm going to deal with some particular cases. And I had 2 options here. I almost thought about giving you guys a choose your own ending sort of situation where I went deeply into one particular exemplary community or sort of skim the surface with respect to several. And so what I've decided, instead of giving you a choice, is just to skim the surface with several, just to show that I think there are different types of exemplary community. There are different ways in which we might want to think about different communities. So I think maybe this will, if you don't like one of them, maybe you'll like some of the other ones, right? That might be a good conclusion for me as well. Then I'll say a few words at the end about the ways in which I think study of these communities might give us something distinctive to think about with respect to moral excellence, right? Distinctive from studies of individual exemplars, that is. So off to the races. Social exemplarity. So let's assume that exemplarism is a general family of approaches in philosophy that take the lives of exemplars as an important source of evidence concerning things like moral goodness, virtue, character, right action, apt emotions, proper motivation. Exemplars often argue things like the reason some course of action is binding is it's this kind of action that an exemplary person would pursue in that set of circumstances or similar set of circumstances. Or they might claim that exemplars show us how we ought to be disposed towards others, or what we ought to care about, what kinds of factors ought to have moral salience in particular circumstances. One might look to exemplars as providing normative guidance for actions in novel circumstances. The key assumption of my project is we can apply this kind of exemplarism to social groups, to whole communities, to institutions, to organizations, or even to groups like professional groups who are engaged in a common project. But it's not immediately clear how we ought to understand what a social exemplar is. So can communities or institutions or social groups be heroic, saintly, full of wisdom? And if so, in what sense? Can we describe their exemplarity in ways that doesn't just reduce to the individual traits of the members? Right? So that's an important question. So one way to think about exemplars is just, so we can distinguish between two ways of thinking about exemplars. So one way to think about an exemplar is to think of that person as the concrete embodiment of moral excellence. This is a person whose lives offer a model or pattern for well-lived human life. Right? These are the really, really good people. Right? Another way to think about them is to think of exemplars as individuals who display an extraordinary or exceptional form of goodness in difficult or demanding circumstances. Now, clearly there are connections here. Right? The person who is a concrete embodiment of moral excellence characteristically does exceptionally good things in difficult and demanding circumstances. But one can do those exceptionally good things in difficult and demanding circumstances without also being the perfect pattern or model of a well-lived human life. Right? So there are different ways in which we might think about exemplarity, and I think we could say the same thing about social groups. So social groups could be the concrete embodiment of moral excellence within a group or as a group. Or, so you might think here, maybe it's the excellence that they exhibit in virtue of the relationships between members of the group. Right? Or you could think that the goodness might be something like a function of the social and relational goods they enact and extend through their collective efforts together. Or you might think about the ways in which these social goods sort of focus their attention together. Or you might think about their excellence as a kind of excellence that's manifested in the ways in which they enable individuals within the group to sustain or deepen or persevere in commitments to important projects, right? Morally valuable projects. So here, I think we can think about their providing a model for what it means to live life together well as a community. Or I think you could say something similar about the second case here. An exemplar, social exemplar, is a group that displays exceptional or extraordinary goodness in difficult or demanding circumstances. Here you might think about a particularly difficult achievement that requires coordination among individuals. So they achieve some great feat together, and they wouldn't have been able to achieve that feat by themselves. Right? So that wouldn't require a commitment to that group itself being somehow the paragon of moral excellence as a community. It would just require that they engage in a coordinated set of activities that accomplish some great and important good. So I think something similar could be said about the ways in which these are connected to each other. But for the purposes of this paper, I'm going to bracket a defense. I'm just going to let this say social exemplars are either those groups that concretely embody some kind of group moral excellence, or those social groups that display some sort of extraordinary or exceptional goodness together as a group. And just let that say that's sort of the operative account that I'm working with. And I'm going to leave the defense to the end, which is to say I'm going to point at groups and say they're like that. and then show you, I think, the kinds of lessons we might derive from studying those types of group. Now, but before I do that, I want to offer a general rationale for why I think it's important to study these types of groups. So one thing I want to say is this: I think we're already in our moral practice, social practice of moral formation, we already do this. Right. So when you think about the things that we consider to be admirable, we often point to individuals, but at times we point to groups. And so I think it's already a function or already part of our moral practices in moral formation, but I want to try to make this more explicit in how this might work with respect to social exemplars. So think about virtue theoretic accounts of moral education. So typically, in virtue theoretic accounts of moral education, what we do is we point to habituation as the process by which individuals cultivate certain types of dispositions. So habituation is often the key part, at least of Aristotelian virtue theoretic accounts of moral education. But it's also the case that if you look at Aristotle and others working within the Neo-Aristotelian tradition, we point to exemplars all the time as part of our moral practice, our social practice of moral formation. And we do that in several ways. So one way is we rehearse narratives of exemplars. So we point to particular individual exemplars and we hold them up as normative models. We rehearse narratives about these exemplars. Reflecting upon their qualities enables the learner to internalize a sense for what it means to be virtuous in concrete circumstances. If one wants to feel and to attend and to think and to act well within these types of situations, one ought to study the exemplar and seek to cultivate a character responsive to the cares and reasons that are salient to the exemplar. Another thing we do in this context is we appeal to the exemplar as a model for what it means to live a fulfilling human life. So we appeal to exemplars to convey a sense for what we as a community take together to mean this is what a good life looks like. This is what it means to live a good life. And insofar as the exemplar is virtuous, we build into those narratives connections between virtue and human fulfillment. That is, in rehearsing the stories of these exemplars, we impress upon students a rationale for pursuing virtue. Insofar as you're like the exemplar, and so far as you're like this individual, you will see that you are also living a life that's worthy and good and fulfilling. A third thing we do is we hold up exemplars as aspirational ideals. So this often occurs, and I think Zagzebski is right about this, through the emotions of admiration and respect. So when you hold up an ideal and you tell stories about these ideals, truthful stories, but stories that impact the person's emotions in such a way that they truly desire to be like those exemplars. So often people come to love particular goods because of their expression in the lives of those they find admirable. So exemplars can inspire a love of goodness even before one develops an adequate account of the nature of the virtues or why one ought to pursue them. So we tell these stories about exemplars in part, I think, in these three ways, right? They function as normative ideals or models. They function to give us an account of why virtue is fulfilling. They function as aspirational ideals through the emotions of admiration and respect. And I think arguably we can do the same thing with social exemplars. It's going to be a little different, though. Right? So sometimes we point to particular communities as normative models for how our community ought to be. Right? So when we look at the expression of virtue or goodness within a community, and we look at our own communities and we say the ways in which our own communities are deficient or fail to meet up to those standards, we say, oh, that's really what we ought to be like. We really ought to live as a community like that. Right? Or we look at the relationships within particular communities and we say, man, I really wish that the relationships I had within my parish or within my community or within my colleagues at my institution was like that. Right? I really wish I had that kind of community. I would flourish much more in such a community if I had that. Right? So we point to particular communities in that way. And often it works to focus on communities as aspirational ideals. So insofar as we see another community that we really wish our communities would exemplify, we develop a desire to form our communities in such a way as that they could become like that community. Now, it's difficult, of course, because even if I form that desire, like I want to live in that kind of community, others within my community might not have that same desire, right? So I get this other desire, namely to encourage those other members of my community to also desire that, right? So it's interesting how these dispositions work, right? So when the emotion of admiration or respect hits and I see this community, it inculcates in me a desire to have that kind of community. And because I see as a necessary means to that end that other members of my community share that goal, I have to encourage them as well. I have to get them to admire the same things. I have to get them to respect the same sorts of things so that they can have that same desire, right? That's tricky, right? And often this is what happens in this context. What happens is the failure is there, right? You can't get those individuals to love the same types of, or love the same form of community, right? So you're stuck. So this is tricky. So what do you do in those contexts? Well, maybe you find a different community, right? You find other friends, find other people so that you can cultivate a better, so that you could be more like that ideal. Or this might be one of those really, really sad sorts of things that you don't have a way. I mean, maybe you just don't have a way out of that institution, right? You're slaving away at your work at a particular institution. No one in your department wants or cares about being good colleagues to each other or cares about the good of the major, and there's really no way out because the job market's awful, right? So you're stuck. So what do you do, right? How do you cultivate those good sorts of communities in that context? It's very, very hard. Nonetheless, these communities serve as aspirational ideals. Sometimes, let me just say this last thing. By the way, that was not at all autobiographical. So I thanked my university at the beginning of this talk, right? So one thing I want to say is sometimes appealing to particular communities helps you to see moral needs that you didn't even realize were present. Right? So I think this is what happens sometimes, especially when you look at communities like L'Arche, where there is an intentional effort to cultivate friendships between those with diverse mental capacities. Sometimes telling these sorts of stories helps to trigger in you an emotion. Right? I really want to be like that. And as you experience that emotion, as you reflect on that emotion, you think it's because there's an important need there that I didn't even realize that I had. And that it's only in the context of these types of relationships that need can be fulfilled. Right? So I think there's an important component of looking at communities, even for giving you a sense for the kinds of needs that need to be addressed. Right? Okay, so that's the general rationale, and now I do the pointing. Now I say, here are some communities that both have been recognized as exceptional, but which you can learn from as you study the communities more carefully. So let's start with this French village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. This French village was the first community to be recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to victims of the Holocaust. So other communities have since been recognized, but this was the first. They were honored collectively for their extraordinary efforts to provide shelter to Jewish refugees during the Nazi occupation of France. The rescue efforts were initiated and led by André and Magda Trocmé, pastor and wife. And those two individuals in studies of exemplarity have been pointed out as exemplary individuals. I agree with those accounts. They are exemplary individuals. But trying to explain what the Chabonnais did by pointing to them alone is going to miss a big part of what actually happened there. So, although they initially led this effort, it was really a loosely coordinated effort of the whole community and surrounding villages, along with foreign and domestic aid agencies. Working together, they responded to the needs of the refugees as they fled the Nazis and officials in the Vichy government. Some of the villagers directed a boarding school in which children received shelter, meals, and education. Villagers and foreign workers collaborated to try to smuggle some of these refugees out of France and into Switzerland. And although each of these individuals engaged in personal acts of courage and care, it was the commitment on the part of the whole community that enabled them to rescue between 3,000 and 5,000 refugees, many of whom were children, over the course of a 3-year effort. This feat couldn't have been accomplished by any of those individuals acting on their own. It certainly couldn't have been sustained for that long in increasingly dangerous circumstances without the whole community coming together. But their exemplarity is not reducible to that one feat of saving so many children. They were exceptional not just for that, but for the manner in which they did it. So this is a largely Christian community, Protestant, and one of the things they did was to provide ways in which for these Jewish children and Jewish refugees to continue practicing their own faith. They never sought to convert. They never sought to do anything like that. What they did was provided spaces in their own churches for these Jewish refugees to engage in Jewish ceremonies and rituals and to continue to practice their faith. Not only that, they engaged in nonviolent resistance. So they were pacifists. Trachme and the assistant pastor, Thies, were both pacifists. They preached it from the pulpit. And they engaged in nonviolent resistance. They encouraged all the community members to do so as well. And some scholars think that this is part of the reason they were able to save so many children. If they had engaged in violent resistance, it's much more likely that the government would have taken an interest in them, right? But the fact that they were peaceful meant that they didn't really have to care about them. And so this provided an extra way in which that they could save as many children as they did. And part of this was borne out by a fundamental commitment to the essential value of each human person, the human person who's the neighbor or refugee, and the human person who is a Nazi, right? So they truly try to live out the Christian injunction to love one's enemies, right? By engaging in peaceful non-resistance, right? Or peaceful resistance, excuse me. So this is the first community, and I think it's worth considering their efforts. This I think would be considered one of those cases of extraordinary or exceptional goodness that does not require that each member of the community be virtuous in any way, right? Some of them were clearly very virtuous. Many of them were just ordinary, flawed human beings, but they knew that everyone else was participating in this effort. That sustained their interest in ongoing work. They were engaged in social practices, weekly attendance of church services, weekly engagement in scripture studies, and there were people who held sort of small group Bible studies throughout the village. It's just kind of scattered over the hillside. And they would go, and the people who led these groups would be the ones who were collecting information about who had space. Right? So it served dual purposes. Right? These social practices helped to continue the project over 3 years. So this is the first community. Second community is the Trappist monks of Tiberine, who have become the focus of a recent movie of Gods and Men. It's a beautiful movie. So it's a Trappist monastery that was founded in 1938 in Tiberine, Algeria. By the early 1990s, there were 9 monks who lived together, devoting their lives to work, prayer, and contemplation. Few of the members of the religious community had been living at that monastery 40 years at the time of their death. They served each other and their local community, seeking to build friendships with the majority Muslim population. Like all monks belonging to their order, they took an oath of stability, a promise binding each of them to the particular community until the end of their lives. Father Christian, the prior of the monastery, was known for his commitment to interfaith dialogue with Muslims, and Father Luke, one of the monks, offered free medical care to anyone in the community, including those who would eventually threaten their lives. So in the early 1990s, Algeria was in the midst of an increasingly violent civil war, and an armed Islamic group, the GIA, an extremist group, ordered all foreigners to leave the country. So the Trappist monks had a decision to make at that point. Would they leave? They had taken an oath of stability, which bound them to the group, to the community itself, to the order, but also to this space. And each individual had to make the choice, but they together made the choice to stay, right, in spite of this order. And they made a commitment to remain in solidarity with the peaceful Muslim neighbors who were their friends, right? The GIA eventually abducted 7 of them. Sorry for the spoilers on the movie, but they eventually abducted 7 of these monks, demanding as a condition for their release, the release of political prisoners. It didn't end well. The Algerian government, of course, refused, and they killed these monks. Right? Here's a witness of a willingness to stand with and be with individuals in the midst of civil war. That is, I think, a startling witness to what most people would do in this context. Next one. is the town of Geel, Belgium, which for centuries this community has welcomed individuals with mental illness as borders within families, offering shelter, care, friendship, and meaningful opportunities for social engagement within the community. This community traces its origins back to the legend of Saint Dymphna, patron saint of the mentally ill, whose tomb is located near this town. Reports of the miraculous healings attributed to Saint Dymphna established this region as a place of pilgrimage for those who are suffering. As pilgrims arrived, people in the surrounding villages began to offer boarding to them as visitors. And this system of offering housing was largely informal, but by the start of World War II, the families in Geel were hosting nearly 4,000 individuals as permanent boarders, almost a quarter of the population at that point. Currently, there are somewhere between 250 and 500 boarders who live with these families, fully immersed in communal life. So, although this originally emerged out of a need to provide space to these individuals, these pilgrims, it's now an organized community psychiatric health program. And it's actually considered to be a good example of the best kind of mental health program. If you read, there's a great report on Geel on the podcast Invisibilia, where they talk about the ways in which a long history of welcoming those with mental illness into one's community changes the way one perceives mental illness, right? And the ways in which one engages with those who are mentally ill. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip to the next, which is the L'Arche communities. These are intentionally formed communities that are aimed primarily to develop friendships between those with profound disabilities and their assistants, their caregivers. Usually, so there's a charter here, and the focus is not just about providing for the physical needs of these individuals, many of whom do not have any family assistance. The goal is to develop friendships, right? And though it's really countercultural about this type of home, is that they live life together. They eat meals together. They work together. They engage in life in all sorts of ways where they can actually cultivate relationships. There have been a few exemplar studies about assistants who have lived for a long time within these communities and trying to see whether or not there are differences between those who have lived for a long time in such environments compared with those who have lived only a short period of time, to track the effects on the character and the formation of those individuals. The assistants often describe, in these contexts of these exemplar studies, the core members of these homes as not just friends, but their own guides in spiritual formation. So they see in the disabilities and in the needs of those who have profound cognitive disabilities a similar sign of their own spiritual woundedness and their own need for healing. And they act together in this sort of mutual concern and care for the cultivation of each. So here are 4 communities, right? 4 communities that I think display an exceptional form of goodness and which I think we have a lot to learn from. So here's what I'm just going to say in conclusion, because I've got just a couple minutes. Each of these communities, I think, manifest a kind of goodness that you can't describe just by appealing to the individuals alone. So are there good and virtuous and exemplary individuals in these communities? Of course. But there's something about the collective effort itself which is worthy of our attention and emulation as communities. So the Chabanais exhibited extraordinary courage and compassion in their rescue of the Jewish refugees. They demonstrated deep respect for the conscience and religious commitments of those they sheltered. And they offer us, I think, a picture of what it means to be hospitable as a group to those who are in deep need. So what can we learn from thinking about the Chabanais, about our own community's reactions to current refugee crises, for instance? How do the visions that they have of the value of individual human life, what can we learn from that in terms of thinking about our own communities and our own perhaps deficient ways of thinking about the values of the lives of those who are refugees? The Trappist monks of Tibrin demonstrated a real solidarity with their Muslim neighbors, an unwillingness to leave them when they could escape to safety. They demonstrated a goal to be peacemakers. There's a pivotal scene in the movie where Father Luke offers care to a person who has just threatened his life, right, and provides medical assistance. Right? What does this show us? So this is an individual, But there's something about living in that community for that long period of time that has enabled him to be the sort of person, right, who can engage in that kind of peacemaking. Right? There's something about the collective effort itself of staying with them and continuing on in that work that I think gives, strengthens the individual commitment to offer care. The families of Geel, who house these borders, I think offer us a picture of what happens over the long course of time and how one perceives mental illness when one lives within a community where mental illness is not institutionalized or shunned or silenced, but is enabled to be part of the normal course of life. Finally, L'Arche, I think, teaches us important lessons about the kinds of relationships we need to be in order to live truly flourishing lives. So, are our relationships only with those who are like us? Or are they relationships that are mutually good for us because they involve those who are not like us in important ways? So I think we learn a lot from looking at these communities and by studying them well. And the eventual defense of the notion of social exemplarity, of course, needs to show that we can't reduce this kind of exemplarity to the individuals who are parts of these communities, but to features of the group itself. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Hey, time for questions. So we'll start here. Everyone else keep your hands up and I'll add you to the list. So start.
I wonder if you at all been tempted by the idea that there isn't such a thing as individual exemplarity, or it's very rare, most of it's social exemplarity. So thinking about this in the political case, so we often think of these singular individuals, but they're largely parts of movements, right? Community of people that they're part of. And that's what enables them to act exceptionally as individuals as well. Are you tempted to go that step further, or are you?
I'm tempted, yes, very much so. In part because I think so much focus on individuals brackets, so even just focus on individual virtues brackets these crucial social dimensions about virtue formation, right? And some types of communities are really, really good at forming people's character in such a way that they can engage in these exceptionally good acts. Other communities are not so good about that. So it would be interesting to look at these individual exemplars. So one tricky thing about that move is to think about Holocaust rescuers, right? Many of whom grew up in the similar sorts of environments, but some of whom actually engaged in these types of rescue and others who didn't. So I don't know, so that's the kind of thing that keeps me from making that move initially. But I think there's something to be said for that type of move.
Next question.
Thank you so much. It's just like thinking about this stuff always gets you want to go and
yes.
Likewise. Yes,
right.
So this is good. A question, I'm not quite sure how to formulate, but basically the gist of it is this. It seems to me that maybe there's a distinction to be made between like the communities that are set up in such a way as to allow people to like be virtuous there, and communities that like there's no specific, like there's no setting up. There's like kind of a spontaneous bubbling up of this virtuous behavior. So it seems like the first example of the French village is like this spontaneous thing that happens, right? And then other communities come, like I don't know, Taizé communities, right? Or like Bogri, whatever, where it seems like there's a structure, and then like anybody can come and be plugged into the structure.
Yeah.
So is there a difference in those people, like in those communities? What do you think? The first kind tells us, yeah.
Yeah, so I haven't thought enough about, so part of the reason for including different types of communities, so you have Le Chambon, which, so there's a very inspiring pastor, right, who stands at the head of this, right, and he's preaching consistently about the value of human life and the need for peaceful non-resistance and love of enemies, and so this, if you are constantly there under his teaching, right, you receive that. There's still some spontaneity to it, but there's still sort of a structure in place. There's still principles being appealed to, and there's a figurehead for this movement. But then Geel is sort of just like, hey, all of a sudden we have a bunch of pilgrims here. We don't have anywhere for them. We start housing them, and then this launches a centuries-long practice. So the point of putting these different types of communities up is to say there are different ways in which they might might arise. And I don't want to just look at those communities that are intentionally formed, like L'Arche. Like, here's the charter, right? This is the charter that governs all of these homes. This is what we act in accordance. These are the principles that we act in accordance with. So it's interesting to look at those that sort of spring up organically. Like, why do they spring up organically in this case? And what can we learn from studying them? I'm not sure really what to say yet about that. I just was trying to point to different types of communities, some of which are intentionally structured, some of which emerge organically, to say there are different ways in which these might arise. But in studying them, what can we learn about particular types of virtues, right? So I need to think more, though, about that. Like, are there different lessons that we might learn from those that emerge organically from those that are formed intentionally? It's important. So let me think some more about that. Yeah.
So the next one on the list is here, but if other people have questions, keep your hand up and I'll add you to the list. So, yeah.
Thank you. This was really interesting, and I really liked hearing the different examples. So when I start to think about collective traits and virtues, I think there are some puzzling features of them. So one puzzling feature of them is that it seems like there can be collective virtues or traits where no individuals have the same traits or virtues. So, you know, I could think of like a group of teenagers who go every week and do service work together. And in that sense, the group manifests generosity. It's a generous group. But you might think that each individual, the only reason they go is to impress their friends or to be able to put on their college applications or something. And so it doesn't seem like they're really doing it from generosity. So I'm wondering what you think about cases like that. But another sort of puzzling feature is, like with individual virtues, we typically think that they're constituted by dispositions to have various mental states or attitudes, like dispositions to desire certain things and intend to do certain things. And it's not clear that collectives have mental states in that sense. So I know those are big questions. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts.
And I was trying really hard not to have to make firm commitments to anything on those. So this is a part of the project that I'm still really not sure of in this case. So let me start with the first example. So yes, clearly there are cases where a group can be generous where none of the members are. And in fact, many of them are not acting out of any kinds of settled states. And if they are, they're self-interested or they're some self-serving or something like that. But the group itself is doing something really, really good. Good, right? That's great for me, right? Because the point is to say that there are types of groups that are exemplary and you can't reduce that to the individuals, right? So, good. I would be grateful for those types of examples, and I think they serve this. Now, the next question for me then is, by looking at that group generosity, say, is to look at the ways in which, over time, participation in such a community transforms the individuals such that they have a character trait that they wouldn't otherwise have, right? That's what we hope for in those types of teenage group examples, right? That's what we're trying to do, is to foster them in this type of virtue. And we do so by often using their base interests at that point, right? And trying to ratchet them up into something better. So I would be fine with those examples. Now, are there collective types of mental states? I don't want to make a firm commitment on that. Sometimes, some days of the week, I'm tempted to say that there are group agents, right? And the dispositions would inhere in those types of group agents. I'm just not sure yet I want to commit to that. So let me say two things about the ways in which I think of ascriptions to collectives of virtues or vices that maybe might get me off the hook without having to make that commitment. Right. So one way one might ascribe virtues to a collective is to say the group is virtuous in virtue of the fact that the members are all committed to good common projects, right? And so here, to borrow Adam's views on common projects, there's something virtuous about caring appropriately for good common projects. And that's all the individuals have to care in that sort of way, in the right sort of way, but they're doing something together, right, which is really important and good. So that's one way one might ascribe virtues to a collective. Or you might say a collective that doesn't engage in that good common project fails to manifest virtue in ways that are bad for that group. Or a group that collectively engages in bad common projects. Adam says at one point in A Theory of Virtue most of the horrendous evils that happen in the world are those involving individuals who are engaged in bad common projects. Right? And so I think that there's something to be said for ascribing vice or virtue to groups in virtue of that participation in common projects. The other thing one might say is, to borrow some of the literature, Elizabeth Anderson has a piece on institutional virtue, where she says, you ascribe a virtue to an institution insofar as that institution is facilitating or promoting or encouraging virtuous dispositions in those individuals. It has social structures that do those sorts of things. Or they have social structures that remedy defects in individuals in important sorts of ways. So that's a second way one might do that without having to appeal to collective mental states. Thank you.
We've got quite a lot of people on the list already, so try and keep your questions as brief as possible. Next question on the list is,
I just wanted to ask about whether you've delved into friendship at all, or whether you've specifically delineated the limits of the communities you're considering, because it seems like there's a lot of material out there on the virtues of friendship and things like that.
So the part of the reason why I'm no longer, or I'm not trying explicitly to talk about communal exemplars or exemplary communities, and I'm trying to use the language of social exemplarity, is to be broader in that sense. So, so to borrow Adams again, friendship is a common project, and to care appropriately about friendship is to care appropriately about a good common project, insofar as it's a good friendship. And so I want to be able to capture particular types of friendships as a kind of social exemplarity. I would be very happy with that outcome.
It seems like that is more accessible to empirical work than larger scale communities.
Yeah, that's true. There's, to my knowledge, other than the exemplar studies of L'Arche, where the studies are about individual caregivers and the effects of participation in those communities, to my knowledge, there are no empirical studies of groups, and it's understandable why there wouldn't be. Right? It's hard enough to study the individuals, right? So, okay, thank you.
next on the list is you.
My question was, I'm wondering whether you think that there are virtues that sort of every group should have, and virtues that are sort of more particular for certain kinds of groups. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. Or like whether certain traits count as virtues for some groups but not others, that kind of thing.
I haven't thought about that question. I do think that if you look, so part of my worry in the pointing to these particular communities is all of them happen to be communities that are rooted in a Christian view of the virtues, right? And so that's a limitation in my selection method. And it's, nonetheless, I think people often point to these communities who don't share those Christian conceptions of courage or of self-sacrifice or grace or self-giving love or something like that. So I need to think more about whether there are virtues that all exemplary communities or all social exemplars possess. And I also need to think more specifically about whether there are types of community that are exemplary because they manifest types of virtues that, for instance, some traditions wouldn't recognize as virtues, whereas others might recognize as virtues. So I need to think a little bit more about that before I can say. I just haven't thought about it well enough, but that's a good question. Appreciate that.
Hi, thank you for that paper. That was really interesting. So your answer to the question for what is being admired is the group that's being admired, or something like it's the group that's the exemplary thing. Who and what is doing the admiring? Is it the case that it's the individual doing the admiring, or is it the case that it's the group that's doing the admiring? So if you already accept an activation, so could it be the case that it's the group or the individual?
So my answer to the question is both. So sometimes it's the individual who admires the group, and I think suppose I'm in a community and we as a community admire this other group. Right? I actually think that's going to be helpful if we together admire the same thing. It's going to be helpful in as a sort of mechanism for making us as a group want to become like that thing. And that kind of collective admiration is going to affect my own individual admiration in ways that my individual admiration alone can't. So I want it to be both, and I think it's actually stronger if we as a community admire this group together. If you read Philip Halley's really important book on Le Chambon sur l'Union, it's very interesting towards the end. He talks about his own admiration for this group because he was a soldier, fought against the Nazis, killed Nazis, and here he is as a professor of philosophy reflecting upon this group that was peacemaking. And he says in the course of the book, when I started studying this group, I found myself resentful of them, right? Because they were so holy and so good, but they didn't really do anything to stop the Nazis, right? And I did, right? And so he's sort of struggling with his own sort of resentment towards this group. But then towards the end, he says, the language switches from individual pronouns to plural. We hope that we are like them in similar circumstances. And so I think it needs to be both, and it's especially important for groups, of which I'm a part. If we admire that exemplary group, it's much more likely that we together can become like them if it's just me alone.
I'm afraid this will need to be the last question.
So this is just a kind of friendly affirmation of your sense that you can get by with your project without needing to appeal to things like group agency, group mental states, in order for us to talk about virtues of communities. One way to do that is to kind of go pluralist about what a virtue is, and make it something like this, something as thin as excellent functioning, right? And now notice we have excellent functioning within individuals, character traits. People like Sosa and Greco are happy to talk about excellent functioning of faculties, and then yours would fit in sort of on the social end. But those all seem to me perfectly respectable uses of the term virtue, and unified by this sense of excellent functioning. So just a suggestion.
Thank you.
Okay, let's stand up.